Good evening.
Hello. Good evening. You can hear me back there. Thank you. I appreciate that. Welcome to History Pub. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones, and I work with the Oregon Historical Society. We're one of 3 partners who put on the History Pub programs. There's the Oregon Historical Society, there's the Holy Names Heritage Center, and there's McMenamins, of course, which is where you are right now, as you probably knew. How many folks have never been to a History Pub program before? All right. Well, welcome. We host History Pub on the last Monday of every month here in the theater at the Kennedy School. A lot of folks are not as familiar with the Holy Names Heritage Center as the other 2 partners, and I'll say that the Sisters of the Holy Names have been here in Portland for over 150 years, and they have the Holy Names Heritage Center makes all of the wonderful documents and historical records that they have created here in Oregon available to researchers. So it's a fantastic resource. They have some other public programs that they put on at their center in Lake Oswego, and they also have an event rental space. So be sure to check out the Holy Names Heritage Center, especially if you're not already familiar with them. History Pub is funded by a grant from the Multnomah County Cultural Coalition. Does anybody know what that is? All right, somebody's nodding because they've heard me talk about it before. But the Multnomah County Cultural Coalition represents the Oregon Cultural Trust in Multnomah County. And for those who don't know, the Oregon Cultural Trust is a really outstanding statewide program that we have that allows you to double your impact of the funding that you give to cultural organizations in Oregon for free. So when you give to an organization like the Oregon Historical Society or KBOO, you can, and 1,400 other cultural nonprofits across the state, you can match that donation with one to the Oregon Cultural Trust. And when you do your taxes, that donation that you match to the trust, you get it back. And the money goes out to support things like History Pub and a number of other programs. So check out Oregon Cultural Trust or ask me if you have any other questions about that. At the Oregon Historical Society, we're really grateful to be supported by a large number of members from across and beyond Oregon, as well as private donors and corporations and grant funders and the state of Oregon and the voters of Multnomah County, who several years ago enacted a property tax levy that supports the Oregon Historical Society and 4 historical societies in East Multnomah County. Our thanks for that property tax is expressed in numerous ways, including free admission to the museum and research library downtown and discounts on membership with OHS. So if you haven't taken advantage of that, please do. So with that advertisement completed, I will introduce tonight's speaker. Marc Brown is now Chief Deputy Defender with the Oregon Office of Public Defense Services in Salem. As he explained to me, it is his job to fight the state, and he is paid by the state to do that. So yay, democracy. He received a Fulbright Scholarship to teach a course on the U.S. Constitution in Guangzhou, China, which he completed just a year or 2 ago. He is the author of many articles, including in the Oregon State Bar Bulletin and other legal publications, as well as in the Oregon Historical Quarterly. Some of you who are regular OHQ member or readers may remember his article from fall 2011 about the history of People's Food Co-op in Southeast Oregon. If you haven't read that, it's a great piece. He's also taught history and political science and even anthropology courses at Washington State University in Vancouver. And we are really pleased to have him here tonight to explain to us in ways that we can understand one of the most fascinating Supreme Court cases to come out of Oregon. So please join me in welcoming Marc Brown.
I'm going to take this out because I wander a bit. Hopefully I won't mess you up. I feel like I should be giving my ninth grade student government speech here in the auditorium. And thanks, Eliza, for that introduction. Another aside, if anyone is here who wants CLE credits, contact the bar, tell them you came here. it should be pre-approved. If not, it will be. So that's just getting that out of the way. And thanks for coming. We're going to go back to a time not that long ago, but it seems like a long time ago. It was a time of great income inequities. It was a time when there was a very significant longshoreman strike in Portland. It was a time where there was high unemployment in Portland and around the country. And it was also a time when there were stagnant wages. It sounds familiar, but it was 1934 where we're going to be looking at. And it's really the story of Dirk DeJonge, a communist from Portland who changed the law in a way. Now, as Eliza said, I am Marc Brown, Chief Deputy Defender at the Office of Public Defense Services. As she said, I'm basically employed by the state to fight the state. In fact, this morning I was at the Court of Appeals arguing 2 cases and then came here. I'm an appellate public defender. What that means is we represent qualified individuals who are appealing their criminal convictions. I used to say indigent individuals, but I was told indigent is not the correct term anymore, so now it is qualified individuals. But so that's what we do. We represent them, and it's not the stuff of kind of television lawyers. There's probably not been a lawyer show on TV about appellate attorneys, because essentially it would be a lot of people sitting at their desks looking at computers all day. Not the good stuff of TV. But what we do is we read a lot of cases and we write a lot of briefs, and we parse words a lot. If those of you who remember the Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal may remember the Bill Clinton asking, when he was asked a question, saying, "How do you define is?" And we get that. Makes perfect good sense to us. How do you define is? So anyway, so that's sort of what I do, but in doing so, I read a lot of cases. And one day, I was working on a case, I don't know what case I was working on, and I came upon this passage from McDonald v. Chicago, which came out in 2010, which was one of the Second Amendment cases that was recently came out of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I'll just read it quickly. In Cruikshank, the court held that the general right of the people peaceably to assemble for lawful purposes, which is protected by the First Amendment, applied only against the federal government and not against the states, citing to that case. Nonetheless, over 60 years later, the court held that the right of peaceful assembly was a fundamental right safeguarded by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, citing DeJonge v. Oregon. Now, DeJonge v. Oregon is a case that you read in law school. It's a significant case for law school, and you don't look at it that much again. And I went to law school in Idaho, and so it didn't strike me as, oh, Oregon, what's that about? When I read this, I was like, oh, what is DeJonge v. Oregon? I mean, what's the case about? And who is this DeJonge person in DeJonge v. Oregon? And what happened with this? So, of course, it's probably more interesting than the case I was working on. So I decided to pursue it a bit, and ultimately brings us here. But before we get to DeJonge v. Oregon, we have to talk a little bit about labor history. And going back to the pre-industrial revolution, looking at this cordwainer. Now, I used to think that these were cobblers, people who make shoes. I always thought it was a cobbler. And recently, I discovered that, in fact, these are cordwainers. And a cordwainer is someone who belongs to the guild of the Worshipful Company of Cordwainers. Amazing what kind of weird things you come up with. Cobblers are the ones who fix shoes. Cordwainers make shoes. And a cordwainer is allowed to use new leather. A cobbler is not. What that means is that a cobbler fixes shoes, but cobblers would also sometimes make shoes out of scraps. For people who couldn't afford nice shoes, they would cobble together shoes, ergo the term. So anyway, but let's go back to our cordwainer here. So he is someone who made shoes, probably made them in his back room of his shop, or in his shop, and he probably sold the shoes out front. Maybe his wife and kids helped him. Maybe he lived upstairs. He owned all the tools. He owned the leather. He controlled everything. He controlled the prices he charged. and he controlled his labor. That was pre-industrial revolution. Then the industrial revolution occurred. These are our modern cordwainers, and they don't own the leather, they don't own the equipment, they don't own anything. And that really changed how people survived, because they no longer had control of their wares, but they did have control of their labor. So they could say, we're not going to work anymore. Now, if one person says that, it doesn't make a big deal. You know, the owners of the manufacturers say, okay, we'll hire someone else. But if everyone says, we're not going to make, hey, New Balance, we're not going to make your shoes anymore because, you know, you did something that we don't like, or you're making us do something we don't like, you cut our wages or something, they all walk out. New Balance says, hey, this is a problem. So that was really when the labor movement began, during the Industrial Revolution, when all people had was their labor. And they would be able to, the only power they had was to strike. Which brings us to our story, now that we've given the 5-minute lecture on labor history. As I said, we're in 1934. 1934 is during the Great Depression. High unemployment, as I said, income inequity, lots of people out on bread lines. You've seen the pictures. It was also about the time when many of the New Deal programs were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. U.S. Supreme Court at that time said these New Deal programs that Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed, that he enacted, that were enacted by Congress and he signed, that they were unconstitutional. So they were struck down. And it was also a time of great labor unrest, especially in the West Coast. There was a lot of labor unrest on the docks with the Longshoremen. The Longshoremen were basically being pushed faster and faster, work faster and faster, unload more and more, but getting the same wage. There was also an issue with gang bosses on the docks. The gang bosses were the ones who did the hiring for the stevedoring companies. And the gang bosses would say, you know, I'm going to give you a job if you give me a kickback, or I'll give jobs to my relatives or my friends. And so many people were unemployed because they didn't know the right people, they couldn't give a kickback, or they were suspected to be communists who were not getting work there because there was great fear of strikes, which happened. On May 9th of 1934, every West Coast port went out on strike, from Bellingham, Washington to San Pedro, California. The strike ultimately lasted 82 days and ultimately shut down a lot of the West Coast. Here's an article from the Voice of Action noting that the strike wave hits the Northwest. But it wasn't just the Northwest that summer, the summer of 1934. There we go. Summer of 1934, there were strikes all over the country. In fact, in the summer of 1934, many people say that it was the closest this country ever came to labor war, to class warfare. There was the Kohler strike in the upper Midwest in Wisconsin. Kohler makes bathroom fixtures. You know, bathroom fixtures, if they go on strike, that could be a problem after a while. There was a strike of the Teamsters in Minneapolis. The Teamster strike in Minneapolis shut down much of the upper Midwest for commerce because they were the ones who moved all of the goods. There was also a textile workers' strike in the Southeast. The textile workers' strike was a very large strike, shut down much of the textile industry in the Southeast. There was also the Autolite strike in Toledo, Ohio, and that led to a 5-day battle between 6,000 workers and 1,600 members of the National Guard, known as the Battle of Toledo. So a lot of labor unrest going on, and many in power feared class warfare. If you think about it, this was 1934. The Russian Revolution, which was a labor uprising and class warfare essentially, was only 17 years earlier. So that would be like if we were here today if the Russian Revolution was 1998. So the fact that there was fears of and concerns of class warfare was not unfounded at the time. Like I said, the West Coast ports all closed down, and it really affected labor throughout the West Coast. In Oregon, it was estimated that 50,000 jobs were lost as a result of the strike. In Portland alone, 12,000 to 15,000 jobs were estimated to be lost due to the strike. Ultimately, a few weeks into the strike, the military and the National Guard were called out to break the strike on the West Coast.
Efforts of business interests to forcibly open the strike-paralyzed port of San Francisco failed. Open warfare rages through the streets of the city as 3,000 Union pickets battle 700 police. Guns, tear gas, clubs, and fists bring injuries to more than 80 persons and cause the death of 2. Listen to the strikers' side of the story.
We are asking for a general strike to keep organized labor on the Pacific Coast. We are not only asking for it, but we're going to get it.
Then, with a general strike and additional violence threatened, 2,500 guardsmen move in, commanded by Colonel Mittelstadt.
The California National Guard has been ordered into active service by our governor for the purpose of maintaining law and order in San Francisco and protecting life and property. This we propose to do at any cost.
These idle ships and piers have more than local significance. They are symbols of wasted millions and represent a backward step in our recovery program.
And so the strike, as it went on, there was, again, lots of concern about the effects of it. The stevedoring companies were taking out ads. This is from the Oregonian, May 12th, 1934, so the strike started May 9th. This was a few days later, basically threatening the workers to come back to work. So in 1922, most of you belonged to the ILA, and you walked out on in that strike. You lost. Some of you lost your homes and your jobs. Better stop, look, and listen, for you will lose this strike. You can't win, and you stand to lose everything, your jobs and your homes. Incidentally, they did win. But not at some cost, of course. Here's some photographs. This were pickets at Portland Municipal Terminal Number 1, basically blocking any activity going on at the terminal. This was a photograph a few days into the strike, 3 days into the strike or so, 2 days into the strike, at Northwest 9th and Everett, downtown Portland. And this was where the stevedoring hiring hall was. This is where the workers came to get hired by the shipping companies to unload their freight. All of the striking workers came out to block the buses that were being brought in with workers. So the stevedoring companies were bringing people in by buses to get them hired, and they successfully blocked the buses. This is actually photographed right after they had left, and this was a celebratory photograph. And another photograph, actually, it wasn't until around June 20th that the police finally gave some protection. The Portland City was not going to send the police in, but finally the stevedoring companies convinced the police or the city government to give them police protection. So that's how they finally got strikebreakers in, by transporting them by police. But as you can imagine, they couldn't get a lot of them in there if they're bringing them in small wagons. And so it didn't do much to help the strike. Then on June 20th, the police were assisting the strikers, or the stevedoring companies. On July 11th, Mayor Joseph Carson, put some heavily armed special officers, put them on a Union Pacific train. So that's a flat car that's being pushed by a Union Pacific locomotive. And the idea was to break through the strikebreakers. The businessmen said they were going to open up Terminal 4. Terminal 4 is up by the St. John's neighborhood. And what they did was they decided to go through, and ultimately the police opened fire on the strikebreakers, or the strikers, and those that resulted in the shooting of four of the Longshoreman. There's another woodcut. These two woodcuts were from the Voice of Action. The Voice of Action was a labor newspaper from Seattle back at that time. And this is a woodcut that depicts Mayor Carlson and one of the union leaders bringing a bloody shirt from one of the people who were shot to the mayor and blaming him for that, for those injuries. That became known as Bloody Wednesday. And this led to a call for a general strike. And general strike would be everyone going on strike, all laborers, not just longshoremen, but everyone going on strike to support, as it says, brothers and sisters, the strike of longshoremen seamen is a strike of the entire working class. This injurious, murderous attack cannot go unanswered. Our answer must be general strike to the bloodthirsty ship owners and the government. Meanwhile, things were getting worse. You know, the economy was grinding to a halt. There was limited food in the groceries because everything came in at that time. Most everything came in by ship.
Here are the first pictures of strike-paralyzed San Francisco in the grip of a general labor tie-up. Streets are deserted as surface cars cease running, and citizens unable to travel remain indoors. Only a few automobiles can operate because most filling stations have exhausted their supplies and can obtain no more gasoline. Motor trucks stand idle where their drivers left them. Very little food is being moved into the city, and with a threat of famine before them, crowds jam the markets. But supplies dwindle rapidly, and there is no meat to be had. To the possibility of mob violence is added fear of pestilence, while on every hand closed shops give mute testimony to the disastrous economic consequence of the strike. Mayor Rossi states the position of his administration.
I must insist, first, that law and order shall prevail. Second, that those desiring to furnish the people of San Francisco with the necessities of life must be permitted to do so without hindrance. Third, that the municipal government must continue to function. The general public must and shall be served. I again appeal to the interested parties to permit the President's Arbitration Board to settle the controversy which besets us.
And this is all, that was, again, San Francisco, but similar things were happening in Portland. The attack on the strikers that we saw the woodcut earlier led to a call for a protest rally. This protest against the raids of all workers, calling for a mass meeting on Friday, July 27th at 8 p.m. And basically it was to show the ship owners and city government is guilty of these acts. 4 strikers shot, 4 raids on Marine Workers Union, raids on headquarters of communists, international labor defense, organizations of unemployed and relief workers, seizing typewriters, raids on private homes, framing and jailing workers' leaders using vicious criminal syndicalism law as threat. They thus act as strikebreakers, use mass pressure all out. And so it's calling for this rally at the Unity Center, 68 Alder Street, on Friday, July 27th. That, for those of you who know Portland, would be, I think, where there's now an on-ramp to the Morrison Bridge. I think is where this used to be located. And the rally happened, or the meeting happened. Unfortunately, the police quickly raided it. Hundreds of people were there, about 150 spectators. Police arrest 8 in new red raid. Children in the hall. My God, there were children in the hall. Listening to alleged agitators. DeJonge taken again. It's interesting to note at the very bottom, you see the police red raid squad. That was the red squad that the Portland police had for a number of years, both before World War II and after World War II. And its job was essentially to infiltrate the communists and other organizations that were believed to be communists in Portland and find out, get information on them. I mean, sounds terrible now, but one of the cool things about the Red Squad was they saved everything. And the archives are actually, the Portland City Archives has these huge Red Squad files. So all of these flyers that you're going to see, that you've been seeing, are all part of that Red Squad files that would have been lost otherwise. So on the one hand, we say, oh, Red Squad, terrible thing. But on the other hand, from a historian perspective, it's actually very cool. So anyway, DeJonge taken again, which brings us to Dirk DeJonge. Here's his mugshot. This actually was from an arrest that was about a week earlier. He was arrested for passing out pamphlets on the streets, charged with criminal syndicalism. But let's go to a better photograph, because I like this photograph better. He's kind of sharp dressed in this photograph. But we don't know a whole lot about Dirk DeJonge. We do know that he was born on August 30th of 1890 in Zaltbommel, Holland, and excuse me for my terrible pronunciation. And he immigrated to the United States in 1911 at the age of 21. We do know that in 1917 he was living in Tonawanda, New York, which is around the Niagara Falls area just outside of Buffalo. This is actually his draft registration card for World War I. And we know that he served 8 months in the military of Holland. He was in the infantry. And he did serve in World War I. I'm not sure if he served overseas or not, but he was a World War I veteran. In 1921, we know that he was in Angel Island in San Francisco. Now, I'm not sure what he was doing there. Angel Island at that time was mostly being used by the military for an intake center for returning veterans. For many years, it was being used as that, and then transitioned to other military uses. So he may have been in the military, but I think he wasn't, because the census material I found indicates he was living in what looked like a boarding house. So he may have actually been working on the docks there as a civilian. But by 1931, he was in Portland, and he was the president of the United Veterans Employment League. This is a letter that he wrote to the mayor asking to use the Civic Auditorium, or the City Auditorium, for their meetings. Now, an interesting side note, there was a high veteran unemployment rate at that point. Many people were unemployed. It was also an issue with bonuses. So some of you may have heard of the bonus march. Many veterans were promised when they got out of the military they'd get a bonus, and then the government, because the Depression happened, they didn't have the money around. So what they did when the economy was down, they gave these bonus sheets that said, in 1945 you can collect this money and with interest. And so many of the unemployed veterans felt they were owed a lot of money by the government. So I have a feeling, though, this was a front for the Communist Party, just by doing some research on it. So in 1931, he was president of the United Veterans Employment League. 1932, he ran for mayor of Portland. There he is, Dirk DeJonge. And his slogan was against wage cuts, $10 cash minimum, weekly relief for all unemployed. He did not win. Mayor Carson won, as we heard earlier. He was also pictured in this painting by Phyllis Pele de Lapp. She was a labor artist. She was from San Francisco, spent part of the time when the strike was going on, spent in Portland. She hated it in Portland, by the way. She said it was gray and dark and wet. She was here during the summer. Can't imagine. And she's from San Francisco, so it's not like she was coming from Miami Beach or something. But anyway, this was a painting done of Kirk's Donut Shop, which was on 3rd and Burnside. There's now the Salvation Army Mission, I think, is there. But this was a hangout for labor leaders. And there is Mr. DeJonge pictured there at the... And these are all actually regional labor leaders here that are all depicted in this painting. Now, just as an aside, if anyone has a spare $32,000 hanging around, this is actually for sale in a gallery in California, and the Oregon Historical Society would love to have this in their collection. So if you just happen to have some money hanging around, feel free. So Dirk DeJonge, getting back to Dirk DeJonge, was arrested for criminal syndicalism. And here is the charging instrument. Fortunately, they don't charge him like this anymore. The said Dirk DeJonge and others who were there, on 27th day of July, AD 1934, in the county of McMenamins and state of Oregon, then and there did then and there unlawfully and feloniously preside at, conduct, and assist in conducting an assemblage of persons, organizations, societies, and group, to wit, the Communist Party, a more particular description of which said assemblage of persons, organization, society, and group is to this grand jury unknown, which said assemblage of persons, organizations, society, and group did then and there unlawfully and feloniously teach and advocate the doctrine of criminal syndicalism and sabotage, contrary to the statutes in such cases made and provided and against the peace and dignity of the state of Oregon. They don't charge them like that anymore. Fortunately, they've gotten rid of a lot of the verbiage. Criminal syndicalism. What is criminal syndicalism? Criminal syndicalism, as defined by or described by the Oregon Code at that time, is hereby defined to be the doctrine which advocates crime, physical violence, sabotage, or any unlawful acts or methods as a means of accomplishing or effecting industrial or political revolution. Now, criminal syndicalism comes from on political theory level, it's a movement that advocates direct action by the working class to abolish the capitalist order, including the state, and establish in its place a social order based on worker organization, workers organized into production units. So that is sort of the political theory part of it. The term syndicalism is actually a French term. Syndical, I think, again, ignore the bad accent, but syndical is a French term for labor, or basically a trade unionist. So the law essentially made it unlawful to be a trade unionist, or a laborer in a way. And then the statutes go on to, and excuse me for this wall of words, I don't write this stuff, but this is what you have to do to be convicted of criminal syndicalism. I won't read the whole thing, but any person who, by word of mouth or writing, advocates or teaches a doctrine of criminal syndicalism or sabotage, or who prints, publishes, edits, issues, or knowingly circulates, sells, distributes, or publicly displays any books, pamphlets, paper, handbill, poster, document, or written or printed matter in any form whatsoever containing matters advocating criminal syndicalism or sabotage, or who shall organize or help organize or solicit, accept any person to become a member of any society or assemblage of persons which teaches or advocates a doctrine of criminal syndicalism or sabotage. You get the idea. Pretty broad statute to outlaw what they called criminal syndicalism. It was also, if you notice at the bottom, it was punishable by not less than 1 year, nor more than 10 years, or by a fine of not more than $1,000, or by such imprisonment or both such imprisonment and fine. So you could serve 10 years in prison for basically passing out pamphlets saying, hey, let's go on strike. So pretty serious stuff. And here's, again, one of these Red Squad flyers. These flyers, it was sort of like the Twitter of the day. These would be how people would get messages out. You'd paste these all over the place and hand them out to everyone, which, of course, got you arrested for criminal syndicalism. But this was talking about that the trials were starting on February 13th, and everyone needs to go to the court and basically make a nuisance of yourself. The bosses will do everything possible to railroad these strikers to the penitentiary for 10 years. They will use the press to poison the minds of the workers. So again, calling them out to rally at the courts. Dirk DeJonge was tried. He was tried. It was actually a 3-week trial. And he was, well, in his words, this is what happened at the, this is from his trial. It's actually cited in the Oregon Supreme Court case. Well, at that meeting, speaking as a communist, representing the Communist Party, I went into a discussion of why the Workers' Bookshop, the Communist Party headquarters, the Marine Workers Industrial Union Hall, the Civic Emergency Federation, the International Labor Defense Halls were raided. I told the workers there, at least I laid the background for the reason why these workers, halls, and offices were raided. I told the workers that the reason of these attacks upon the working class organizations was a stepping stone on the part of the steamship companies and stevedoring companies to break the maritime longshoremen and seamen strike, that they hoped to break that strike by pitting the maritime longshoremen and seamen against the communist movement. So that was part of his testimony at trial. He also testified about that there was going to be a rally in the streets in a few days and urged everyone to come out for that rally. As I said, it was a 3-week trial, and the jury first came back 6-6. So jury came back after 3 weeks, split decision. Judge sent them out again. They came back again 8-4. Judge sent them out again. Finally, they came back with a 10-2 verdict. Now, in Oregon, one of 2 states in the country, you can actually be convicted of a non-unanimous verdict, 10-2. So he got convicted by a 10-2 jury. The jury actually said to the judge, you know, we're convicting him, but go easy on the sentencing. You know, don't give him a heavy sentence because, you know, we were not quite sure of this. And this is Judge Jacob Kanzler, who presided over the trial and sentencing. He's also a World War I veteran, incidentally. And he ultimately sentenced DeJonge to 7 years in prison on November 27th, 1934. So quite a significant prison term that he got. It's interesting to note that a lot of the evidence that came into the trial was all this communist literature. The Oregon Supreme Court opinion goes on for pages about all this communist literature that was in evidence at trial. Much of it wasn't even at the rally, at the event that got Dirk DeJonge arrested. So it's interesting to note that he was sort of convicted for being a bad communist. I guess as opposed to a good communist, but anyway. So he was sentenced to 7 years. He ultimately served 9 months, and I'm not sure exactly what 9 months he served. I've never figured out exactly where it was. There's a postcard that, again, found in the Red Squad files, that one side was a picture of Edward Denny, who was a co-defendant, and Dirk DeJonge. The other side was his postcard to the governor, Governor Charles Martin. I hereby protest against a 7-year prison sentence meted out to Dirk DeJonge and 2 years to Edward Denny, convicted of criminal syndicalism for supporting the 1934 maritime strike. I call upon you to grant them unconditional pardons and then repeal the criminal syndicalism law. And you would sign it and send it in. You know, it's, again, now we have, like, on the online, you have all these things that you sign and email out to people, and this was of the day. This is what you did when you wanted to get the attention of the governor. Here's a anniversary rally. This was the 1-year anniversary of the raiding of the Unity Hall that got Dirk DeJonge arrested. And again, here he's speaking, Dirk DeJonge, criminal syndicalism defendants, and it says somewhere on here that they're going to, the people who are convicted of criminal syndicalism are going to speak. So again, I'm not sure when he was in jail or in prison, but he did serve for, like I say, for 9 months at some point. He did appeal. There we go. He appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court. At that time, there was no Court of Appeals. And on November 26th of 1935, the court affirmed his conviction. The issues presented included prosecutorial misconduct, admission of evidence that was an error. That was a lot of the books and literature that wasn't actually at the event. Juror misconduct, and several other issues. The first several pages, again, quoted all this communist literature that was not found at the rally. The court ultimately affirmed his conviction, as I said, based on an earlier case that it had decided on the same issue. In that case, the court concluded that the defendant in that case and his associates in the Communist Party were engaged in acts of serious consequence which contemplated the immediate use of violence and crime based on the literature at that meeting. So in that earlier case, and this case, no one advocated violence or anything like that, but the literature did. This is the Oregon Supreme Court sitting at the bench at the Oregon Supreme Court. In fact, I was, like I said, just arguing a case earlier today at that exact courthouse. At trial and on appeal to the Oregon Supreme Court, Dirk DeJonge was represented by Irvin Goodman. Irvin Goodman was an attorney in Portland for many years and made a career out of representing basically people who no one else would represent. Part of the reason was that he was Jewish, and at that time it was very difficult for Jewish attorneys to make a living. They were not part of the network, and so he would represent whoever he did, and actually made quite a name for himself representing communists and socialists and strikers. Irvin Goodman shared an office with a young Gus Solomon. Gus Solomon, the name might sound familiar. Gus Solomon, we have the Gus Solomon Courthouse downtown. He was a federal judge for many years in Portland, but at this time he was a young new attorney, also having trouble making a go of it. So at trial is a newspaper account that describes Goodman, when he was representing defendant, as a peppery little lawyer. Incidentally, the prosecutor was described as the bald and hefty district attorney. Well, that's not a flattering description. Gus Solomon, and Irvin Goodman was paid mostly by the International Labor Defense Fund, which was partially funded by the Soviet Union at that time. So a little Stalin connection there, if you will. Gus Solomon wrote the petition to the U.S. Supreme Court, asking the Supreme Court to take review of it. Gus Solomon was also paid by the International Labor Defense Fund and the ACLU at that time. And here's another interesting flyer. Greet the return of Dirk DeJonge out on bail pending appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Friday, October 9th at 8 p.m. at Harmony Hall. So again, he was in and out. I don't know exactly when he was in, but another one of these very cool flyers that was around. There. So it was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court accepted review, and it was not a friendly Supreme Court. This is the same Supreme Court that struck down most of Roosevelt's New Deal programs. It was a very corporate-friendly Supreme Court, although soon after this, the makeup changed. Many of you probably remember the court packing incident with the U.S. Supreme Court. This was just before that, and many of the old-timers here left the court soon after this. Not a friendly court, though. And the arguments were made. Here's a New York Times article just after the arguments are made, and over here you can see it notes that while Mr. Tarshish, who was the attorney representing the state, was speaking, Chief Justice Hughes inquired whether participation in any meeting of the Communist Party, even one to discuss a presidential election, carried with it a punishment for felony. Mr. Tarshish replied affirmatively. Not a good answer. Chief Justice Hughes wrote the opinion in the case and of course, found for Dirk DeJonge. And here's just another New York Times article noting that the Supreme Court cases that are coming out on that Monday included the constitutionality of the Oregon criminal syndicalism law, under which Dirk DeJonge, a communist, was sentenced to serve 7 years in prison for conducting a communist meeting during the maritime strike of 1934. And like I said, Dirk DeJonge did ultimately win. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down the statute as unconstitutional. While the states are entitled, the Supreme Court noted, this is quoting from the Supreme Court opinion, while the states are entitled to protect themselves from the abuse of the privileges of our institutions through an attempted substitution of force and violence in the place of peaceful political action in order to effect revolutionary changes in government, none of our decisions go to the length of sustaining such a curtailment of the right of free speech and assembly as the Oregon statute demands in its present application. The greater the importance of safeguarding the community from the incitements to the overthrow of our institutions by force and violence, the more imperative is the need to preserve inviolate the constitutional rights of free speech, free press, and free assembly in order to maintain the opportunity for free political discussion to the end that government may be responsive to the will of the people and that changes, if desired, may be obtained by peaceful means. Therein lies the security of the Republic, the very foundation of the constitutional government. And ultimately, what the case is known for is incorporation. Now, incorporation means that, so we have the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. For many years, they didn't apply to the states. They only applied to the federal government. So First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law, etc., and so on. Not until the 14th Amendment did they potentially apply to the states, although it took many years after the 14th Amendment. In the late 1800s, the court started to incorporate or apply some of those Bill of Rights provisions to the states. They didn't do all of them, and still not all of them do apply to the states. For example, the Bill of Rights says there has to be jury unanimity. As I noted earlier, Oregon has a 10-2 provision. But this case incorporated the Freedom of Assembly Clause, and this is the provision that did it. The First Amendment of the Federal Constitution expressly guarantees the right to meet peaceably for consultation in respect to the public affairs and to petition for a redress of grievances against abridgment by Congress. But explicit mention there does not argue exclusion elsewhere, for the right is one that cannot be denied without violating those fundamental principles of liberty and justice which lie at the base of all civil and political institutions, principles which the 14th Amendment embodies in the general terms of the Due Process Clause. And that's why it was referred to in that first slide I noted from the recent case on Second Amendment, that, sometimes for years the court said it didn't apply, and then the court changed course and said, no, in fact it does. And that is what Dirk DeJonge is known for, the case that incorporated the Freedom of Assembly Clause to apply to the states. We don't know much about Dirk DeJonge after that. He sort of disappears into the mists of history. We do know that he died on March 17th in 1976. We have a couple of snippets here and there. So, for example, we know that in 1942 he was living in Portland because of his World War II registration. So he was still in Portland in 1942. On December 13th of 1956, he was summoned to testify at a House Un-American Affairs Committee, HUAC, hearings in Seattle. He identified himself as a retired lumber worker living at 1415 Southwest Alder Street in Portland. I think that's where 405 cuts through now. My wife always laughs because as we're driving around, I'm like, oh, that's where Dirk DeJonge lived, or here, somewhere. He, of course, refused to answer any further questions at that hearing. But beyond that, we don't really know much. Again, we know that he died in Yamhill County on March 17th of 1976. And he's in fact buried at the Willamette National Cemetery, just south of here, because he is a World War I veteran. He was a private in the U.S. Army. And so Dirk DeJonge, a person who really had probably a pretty hard life, probably was always struggling, was always a laborer. He, by putting himself out there and kind of putting himself in harm's way for what he truly believed in, was able to shape the U.S. laws. And that's part of the great part of our country, is that someone who, has no education, no political background, no connections can make that change. And so we celebrate Dirk DeJonge, and and the fact that he and lots of other people have changed the law for good. And we'll just let Billy Bragg play out here, and then if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Billy Bragg play out. Anyone, are there any questions? I'll happily take some. Yes?
I just have two comments, and I invite your comment on my second comment. The first being the Billy Bragg is great. I loved it. There's a Chicago former punk singer, John Langford, who does some pro-union songs. You might want to look at that. He's plenty tough and it's really great. Secondly, so I can't help but notice that, our interpretation of union behavior in Oregon, that we thought we could legislate against it, has, to me, a lot of parallels with Islam and what we're trying to do in modern day society against Muslims and Islamists. And, I certainly see some parallels there. I don't know.
Yeah, parallels between Islam and the labor movement, and it's with a lot of movements at the time are maltreated by government laws. Other questions?
Yeah, I was interested. You were talking about this what is it?
The Red Squad.
Red Squad, yeah. And I've got my little history of the Portland Red Guide here talks about that. And in that discussion said that a young Vera Katz ran into some difficulties as a young activist, and that the Red Squad existed right down into her administration, and that she actually, as mayor, supported it and defended it.
Yeah, the Red Squad, actually, I did research, as Eliza said, a few years ago, I did research on People's Food Co-op in southeast Portland. And in fact, the Red Squad at times was looking at People's Food Co-op in the early 1970s as a subversive organization, because their business was to overthrow the kind of corporate power of food, and so it was there then. I know that, and I didn't realize it was still into the 80s, essentially, and early 90s.
You said that the Longshore strike was successful in Portland. How so?
It was successful in that they got a wage hike. The hiring practices changed. There weren't a huge amount of success, but it was successful in that they got concessions from the stevedoring companies, which, at that time, any concession would be good. It's interesting, actually, at the time, President Roosevelt was in Hawaii and then on the West Coast. He was cruising along the West Coast in the presidential yacht. There was a presidential yacht back then. And he was coming up to the West Coast, and there was, big fear that there was going to be protests when he came here. The government officials didn't want these protests, and that kind of brought the longshoremen or the stevedoring companies to the table. Pressure from the government to do that, so that was tied into to the settlement.
So I was wondering more about the political analysis of why the U.S. Supreme Court heard it, because not every case gets there. And for example, 10 years earlier, there was the Boggan St. Finn case, and that had everything to do with deciding the issue of race and immigration and naturalization. And you made remarks about that court in particular being a very conservative court. So I was wondering more, what was the larger issue that was sort of up for, sort of like the gay marriage debate in the country, that there's a larger issue that needs to be resolved, and what the sort of tenor of that was.
Question was, what was the larger issue that convinced the Supreme Court to take the case? Because most cases do not get accepted for review at the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, one thing about the U.S. Supreme Court, we don't know why they take the cases or don't take cases. At this time, there were a lot of states had these criminal syndicalism laws, and they were being used more and more to convict people who protest against government. And it seems odd that this court that court would take it. But I think they saw a lot of unrest in the country and saw that, yes, we need to draw the line and protect the Constitution, because it was sort of heading to the direction among the states that, the civil liberties were being seriously impinged upon. With the U.S. Supreme Court, it takes a long time for that to happen. So this has been happening since the 20s, but it was finally in the late 1930s that they did something about it. So it's similar to, as you said, the gay marriage issue. That's been percolating for years. The Supreme Court, many say, is a reactionary entity that will take cases when it's steamrolled and gotten big, and so that's probably what happened at this point. Is it just they were seeing problems all over the country and figured it was time to step in. Again, I don't think the state attorney helped himself at all and helped his cause by saying that, if they were getting together for a presidential debate, they could be arrested and convicted of a felony. I think that was going a little too far, and so I think that actually persuaded the court that this is just too much. Other questions? Great. Well, thanks for coming. One more.
Just a comment.
Okay.
When he was running for mayor, I saw the list of things that they had off on the right. They had what used to be something, I think it was 38, Oregon was a ballot slogan, where you could write something like 12 words. when they were getting ready to get rid of the ballot slogan, when the powers that be wanted to get rid of it, one of the criticisms was that they were coming up with silly slogans. And one of the silly slogans was, you'll get the best government money can buy. But I mean, since then, I mean, it's not such a silly slogan anymore. We've all come to realize we do get the best government money can buy. And there was I was a friend of Wally Priestley here, and he did this test. At one point, with this ballot slogan, they brought in this Bill Wyatt to run against, didn't live in the district, but brought in, running against Wally, all the money he needed to run. And Wally did this test of the ballot slogans, and he flipped them. So that some of his questionnaires had Wally's versus Wyatt, and some of them had flipped it around. And Wally said, according to his polling, if Wyatt would have had Wally's slogan, he would have won. And now Wyatt is ahead of the Board of Court.
Yes. And of course, Dirk DeJonge did not help him, obviously, but he did run. And well, thanks for coming, and come on out for the next History Pub.